Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with Eleanor Goldfield. Our first guest on today's program is no stranger to the Project Censored audience. It is none other than media scholar Nolan Higdon. Higdon's a founding member of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. He is a Project Censored national judge and university lecturer at Merrill College and the Education Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. All of Nolan's work is available on Substack. He is the author of The Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news literacy education, co-author of Let's Agree to Disagree, a critical guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy, The Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people. Higdon is a regular source of expertise for CBS, NBC, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle, telling him any chance he gets what they might do better in their coverage, doing journalism in the public interest. Nolan Higdon, welcome back to the Project Censored Show.
What's up, Mickey? What's up, Project Censored Universe? Great to be back.
It is wonderful to have you back on the program. You've been really busy, and so I'm glad that we've been able to catch up here in early June. You launched a new program earlier this year that I've had the pleasure of being on. It is called the Disinfo Detox. Nolan, what are you doing on the Disinfo Detox, and where can people find out more?
Yeah, I wanted to launch a podcast, which I guess that puts me in a category with everybody on Earth. But I wanted to launch one where I was able to highlight some of the great, media experts and scholars I know in my life and get them to do interviews about what's in the news right now. So it's a way in which, hopefully, for folks who don't have the time to sift through all the headlines, they can tune into a quick episode and kind of catch up on what's going on and hear a different viewpoint than we usually get from corporate media. And I try to bring in a lot of guests, not just scholars, but also activists, journalists are on there as well, to get some different perspectives. And it's been really cool. It's been cool to connect, and we're doing some new stuff. Dr. Sydney Sullivan and I are launching a new feature on the Disinfo Detox where we apply media literacy lens to the headlines that are in the news and kind of show people what they can do when they approach news to better protect themselves from some of the propaganda. And also better understand the news media and all that stuff. We're on all the major podcast platforms, but primarily, YouTube, Disinfo Detox.
So you have another feature that you're bringing into the Disinfo Detox, and it's called the Gaslight Gazette, which is sort of a biweekly nonsense detector. We can't use the other term because of the FCC, but I think everybody knows what we're talking about. Where you have a biweekly dispatch. And you come right out and say it. It's a dispatch from the front lines of the information war. And you have this on Substack, where each edition uses critical media lens to examine stories and narratives in the news with a goal of spotlighting the falsehoods and propaganda that shape discourse in American media. So, this is a pretty interesting time that we're in, Nolan, where AI generated propaganda is all around us. And you're looking to try to debunk that. And you mentioned off air, you weren't sure if there would be enough content to do it every couple of weeks. What did you discover, Nolan?
I could immediately put that fear to rest. The first edition of the Gaslight Gazette came out just about 2 weeks ago on my Substack, and it's a biweekly newsletter that's aimed at saying what's in the news that's false. And it really came from when I was writing the Anatomy of Fake News. To write that book, I was staying constantly up to date on what fake news was in the media. And you and I did that with United States of Distraction as well. But what I was amazed about back then, and this is true before I launched the Gaslight Gazette, we would talk to folks and I would sort of just mention a fake news story. I thought everybody had known it had been debunked, and I'd be the only one in the room who knew that. And so I saw there's a need for it. So I thought, okay, what if I could put out a newsletter that has like the most recent kind of, widespread examples of fake news out every 2 weeks, and hopefully the public could kind of, debunk this stuff in real time instead of waiting, for an academic book to come out 2 years later. But also, it's not just about exposing fake news stories. I also look at some examples of censorship, which is a close friend of fake news. I look at some of the new complications brought about by AI, which are indications of how fake news is going to change and become more complicated in the future. So for anybody who's interested in kind of the flow of information and disinformation and what's in the headlines now, the Gaslight Gazette has been a really cool feature. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback.
Yeah, and if you, I know later on in the program, you can tell people where to find your material. NolanHigdon.substack.com is a place where a lot of it lives these days. You actually had there in your inaugural issue the case of the Chicago Bulls gangster when wearing a hoodie becomes a terrorist offense. You also talked about one of the things that's just remarkable that seems to be still floating around out there was the issue of imaginary gang tattoos. Yeah. Can you remind our listeners? I mean, to me, that just seemed, and they just double down, double down, double down. I mean, it's like true gaslighter material. Hey, by the way, before you answer that, what's a gaslighter?
Yeah, so gaslighter is anyone out there who is spreading information that's half truths, false truths, incomplete truths as a way to disorient a person or population so they don't know what's true and what's false. You're gaslit whenever you start questioning your interpretation of reality. That's when you
2
become
and 2 equals 5. Back to George Orwell.
Exactly. Then you started asking yourself, well, does 2 + 2 = 5? Am I wrong?
Are there numbers?
Feeling. Yeah. Are we allowed to talk about them? But yeah, no, the AI image, I didn't add one part to that story because it's still open-ended, but basically an individual was arrested and deported under the false pretenses that they were a gang member. And the justification for them supposedly being a gang member was they were wearing Chicago Bulls clothing. And then there was the tattoo on the fingers. And so they showed this image of the tattoo on the hands, but as soon as the individual in question was photographed, folks on the internet noticed there was no tattoos on the hands, and Trump had been carrying what is seemingly an AI-generated image of these hands. But the reason I said I left something out of that story is there's a big debate, and this is a serious debate. Some people wonder if Trump actually believes the photo is real, if it's someone in his administration who gave it to him. Because some of the things he said in different interviews, it's not clear that Trump really realizes it's false. I mean, it wouldn't put it past him to send a false information out there, but that's kind of an interesting part of this story as well, is even, people who are spreading fake news oftentimes believe it, whether they created it or not.
I mean, look, not that this is fake news, but we're living in a time where the sitting secretary for the Department of Homeland Security just completely doesn't know the definition of habeas corpus. In fact, says it's the opposite. Later in the program, we'll be talking with Eleanor Goldfield in our "Is This the Best We Can Do" segment, and I know that's going to come up among other things. But I think part of the whole culture and part of the gaslighting element, it just seems to be one of the main ingredients of the Trump administration, right? Is that these aren't the droids you're looking for. Move along. Don't believe your eyes. Yeah, of course that's not torture. Of course that's not, violating the Constitution. Of course that's not genocide. Again, it's not like this is new per se in American culture. We've had plenty of administrations playing with reality and the truth, right? And always trying to move, sway the public opinion more to support their particular agendas. But Nolan, in what's referred to as a post-truth world, which I know you and I reject, how far down into this rabbit hole are we into sort of the postmodern normalization of, well, the truth is what feels right to me?
Yeah, I think we're pretty far down this rabbit hole, and I say that because I could easily point to the work that you and I did just 5 or 6 years ago with the United States of Distraction. We were pointing out how we got to this moment and warning that if we didn't change course, it would get worse. And I think we've been vindicated in that argument. But I also point out way before us, there were people writing and warning about this every small step of the way. I'm thinking of the Daniel Bornsteins. The
Daniel Bornstein. I had it right on hand. Imagine.
Yeah. Morris Berman. These folks all warned along the way. And even, more recently, Kurt Anderson and these folks. So there was warnings along the way that, look, if you guys are going to cut civics, if you're going to cut education, if you're going to marginalize journalism, if you're going to make people economically desperate, if you're going to allow monopoly power, if you're going to allow abuses and corruption in government without holding folks accountable, i.e. Nixon or Iran-Contra with Reagan, or the torture scandals of the Bush administration, or the drone murders of the Obama administration. You're going to allow this to get to this point. We're at that point. And it's almost like our worst nightmare has come true, right? You and I used to say, like, what happens in a world where people don't have media literacy or civics, but they're, the most strongest economy and military in the world? We're figuring that out. I mean, there's constantly media illiteracy on display in this country, whether it's the Signalgate scandal or it's Maha using AI to generate a Health and Human Services report, or there's civic illiteracy on display in this administration constantly. Just today, Marjorie Taylor Greene said she regrets voting for the bill because she didn't know what was in it.
The big, beautiful bill.
You're supposed to figure that out before you vote.
Well, the Patriot Act set that straight. Nobody read the version before they voted on it. It was a different version of it. I mean, there's certainly precedent for that. And the shifting baseline, when Nixon said he was not a crook, Trump can now say that and mean it because of the Roberts Court, right? Yeah. A convicted felon can now say that in the postmodern, in the post-truth world, with the help of the Supreme Court. And you and I warned in the prologue of United States of Distraction with the Lao Tzu quote, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading. And for a long time, when you and I would do public events, one of the punchlines was, are we there yet? Yeah. Well, gosh, that's not funny at all anymore, right? Because here we are.
Yeah, no, we're here. And to your question earlier about the ways in which the Trump administration just fabricates with impunity. Yeah, this is something different. And you can go back. I've ripped Democrats, Republicans for decades. You have as well. So when I say this is different, it's not attacking the Republicans. But Trump has really used this flood the zone strategy. And I think he realized what most authoritarians always kind of knew, but couldn't get into office to make fruition, which is a lot of the protections we have in our democracy really come from norms, not enforceable laws. So in his first administration, Trump was dealing with a lot of news media, which were, influencing a negative narrative against him. So Trump's solution was don't talk to the news media. Well, leaders talking to the news media is an essential part of democracy. We don't actually have a mechanism to force this administration to be open to the press. And he's really closed ranks. Congress is just an enabler at this point on whatever he wants. So he can lie with impunity. And I mean, even like Elon Musk supposedly just left government. Elon Musk never was recognized by the Trump administration as having a leading role at Doge, even though we watched him on TV have a leading role at Doge. I mean, it's that type of Orwellian episodes that we see constantly, but there's no one to hold him accountable.
No, or Musk for that matter. And I mean, we'll be doing a show in the future. We'll have to talk more about the people that are actually, in my view, more influential and dangerous than Musk, including the Peter Thiels, the Curtis Yarvins,
yeah,
the techno-fascists, the dark MAGA crowd. There's Peter Thiel says the quiet part out loud 15 years ago, at a libertarian conference when he talks about our ideology is not popular and won't win elections, but what we'll do is we'll take power with technology. And I think that we've seen the power of technology to corrode and corrupt institutions like the Fourth Estate. And now we have young people growing up in a world where people live in news deserts and don't understand what journalists are, but they want to be influencers. Nolan, talk to us a little bit about that, because among the many books you've written, one of the books you wrote was Podcaster's Dilemma, a couple years back for Wiley. And I'm not making light of this. There are very important people that use social media platforms to deconstruct headlines and fill the void where legacy media has failed. But part and parcel, part of the argument of your book was sort of that it was just going to sort of imitate the worst elements of corporate media. And, kind of like how the internet in the early days was like, it's the information highway. It's the road to equality for all. And while we've seen how that's turned out, you wrote another book called Surveillance Education with Allison Butler. It talks all about how that's going. Anyway, Nolan, back to you on what do you think about that part of the influencer culture? Because in all fairness, you're a pundit also. Maybe someone will say, well, Nolan's trying to influence people. What's the difference?
Absolutely. I think it's a fair question. And the Podcaster's Dilemma it's a book that's often misunderstood, as you point out, because a lot of it does celebrate the podcast space. I'm a podcaster. I listen to podcasts. I love podcasts. Big fan of the art form. But I said at that time, like, they're all operating on corporate platforms. They have to give up privacy to be here. They're funding an alternative to corporate media, but then what they're funding is going to become the new corporate media. And the
Here we
new
are. Are we there yet?
exactly, the new corporate media is not going to make space for people who are questioning corporate power or questioning big tech. And we're seeing that with this consolidation of power. If anybody's paid attention to podcasting in the last like 5 or so years, we've very quickly gone from kind of ragtag podcasting with like your iPhone and your drunk buddies into these studios that are slick recordings, high broadcast quality. They're on corporate platforms like Spotify that are paying millions of dollars to people. Influencers are getting money from corporate America to flood YouTube and other zones. And so basically, the kind of analogy in the 1980s when television was first started being called a wasteland, a commercial wasteland, that's what's happening now.
That goes back to Newton Minnow. That goes back to the 60s, right?
Yeah. And it's here now in the digital realm as well. It doesn't mean there's not a lot of great podcasters doing great work, just like there were great people making great like local broadcast television back then. But the corporate consolidation allows them to marginalize those. You don't get advertising, people don't get access, et cetera, et cetera.
And we're going to use the vehicle right now of a recent article, Nolan, that you wrote, published at The Hill. Too little, too late. A media in crisis blames Democrats for the Biden cover-up. Well, some of our listeners, might say, well, which one? Which ones are we talking about? Well, look, recently our listeners may be aware that CNN talking head Jake Tapper co-authored a book that basically kind of, looks at, it's called The Original Sin, President Biden's Decline, its cover-up, and his disastrous choice to run again. Curiously, people, Nolan, like you and I and others, were talking about this back when it mattered, back when we were wondering how it was happening, that they were skipping an entire primary to hoist to the top somebody that not only had problematic policy backgrounds, but someone that was, someone that really looks more like that they're entering into a retirement phase of a very, very long career in public life, not to be anointed the leader of the so-called free world. But of course, Nolan, since Trump 2.0, much like we saw after Trump 2.1, where the Democrats scrambled to blame anybody and everybody but themselves, Russiagate, etc., we see the same kind of thing going on here with Tapper's book. And you wrote a piece that really talks about, in short, maybe Tapper's book should have been called Maybe I Ought to Look in the Mirror. Anyway, what's the thesis of your piece here, and what are we getting at about the failures of the Fourth Estate? They knew from the inside Democratic circle to party apparatchiks to major people in the corporate media that lied on air. It looks as though we now know that people were aware that there were problems and issues, and maybe he wasn't the most viable candidate for re-election. Nolan Higdon.
Yeah, you said it at the top there. We knew, we were bringing this up constantly on different programs and writing, and this is this thing. When you study media, it happens all the time. You point these things out, and it's like a cycle. You get called a conspiracy theorist, and then about 2 years later, people start murmuring the same thing you had been saying 2 years earlier, and then like 5 years later, everyone in the media admits it's true, and they go, "Well, yeah, we didn't get it right away." But
everyone's always done.
Yeah, like. But anyways, so the book he wrote, my problem with it, Original Sin with Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, they wrote that the Democratic Party are basically responsible, that the people around Biden concealed his decline, and that it really got to the point where it was really bad in 2022, and they lied to the media. And it's all the Democratic Party's fault, and now some people are blaming Jill Biden, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe all that's true. I'm not trying to let any of these people off the hook whatsoever. But the reality is that we knew this as the public. The news media knew this. And it's not just the news media knew it and didn't report it. It's that the news media knew it, and they marginalized and dismissed anybody who brought it up. They treated it like it was some right-wing conspiracy. And it was very interesting because this is coming out the first Trump term, when so many people in the media were very open to the idea that Trump had cognitive problems. We need to use the 25th Amendment on Trump, but they couldn't apply that same lens to Biden. I'm no defender of Donald Trump, made a career out of critiquing the guy, but Biden was showing a lot more signs of the 25th Amendment being needed than Trump was publicly. And in the book, I think Tapper is kind of on this mea culpa tour where he's trying to convince or gaslight us that it is the Democratic Party's fault, not the media's fault for being stenographers for those in power. And that's what I pointed out in the piece. You can't blame the Democratic Party if you're a journalist. If you're a journalist, you got to blame yourself. You didn't investigate. You didn't corroborate. You didn't do the work that was necessary to report on the story. You got it wrong.
Well, you point out that Robert Hur, who was a Department of Justice investigator, that was, and by the way, we're not making light of people in cognitive decline and people that have conditions. Like, this is not, again, this is not a laughing matter. It's not a joke, and it's not an ad hominem, and it's not a gotcha political attack. It's a legitimate line of inquiry that the Fourth Estate is supposed to vigorously interrogate candidates for public office, let the public know how fit they are to serve, how aware they are of things that are happening. And of course, there's evidence that not only did the leadership of the Democratic Party know that Biden wasn't the most viable candidate, there's now obviously other evidence that clearly shows that these people inside the media, they had ample opportunity. They had many, many opportunities and doors open where they could have went in and said, look, we really have an issue that we need to discuss. The American public has a right to know X. And rather than do that in real time when they had the place and time and opportunity, we have Tapper now cashing in on a book a couple years later after nothing can be done.
Exactly. And they normalize certain things that now in hindsight look disastrous. The lack of a primary. I know technically there was a primary in terms of votes were cast, but they treated it like a normal event instead of critiquing it and saying, like, look, the party is allowing this guy to run away with this thing. He's not debating. He's not doing interviews with us. And even after the debate in June that rightly scared so many people, I don't think the media did a tough enough job to answer the question, who's running the country when this guy does have these freezes? I mean, and those are the kind of questions, like you said, it's not making fun of Biden in any way. But if Biden is freezing up like that, or is lost, or is too tired and work needs to be done, who's doing that work? As a citizen of this country, I want to know who is leading the country in those moments, especially when we have things like terrorism, nuclear warfare, economic collapse, all these threats to our livelihood. We want to know who's at the wheel.
So you write in here about the media knowing about Biden's decline in 2019, and by 2020, it's impossible to ignore, but fearing a Sanders upset in the primary, Democrats and media allies close ranks. You and I have written at length about how the Democratic leadership tanked a Sanders campaign in 2016, arguing legally in court that they could choose, they could go back to Tammany Hall smoking cigars in a back room and choose the candidates. The public doesn't have a say. I mean, they were just out and out about it, right? People seem to forget, United States of amnesia style, that this is what we're dealing with, the incompetence and corruption at the top of the Democratic Party, which is not an endorsement of the corruption and incompetence of the Republicans, by the way. Doesn't work that way. We can walk and chew gum. It's both and, not either or. Important lesson. But you point out here, Tapper's post facto outrage avoids that whole historical context, as if Tapper wasn't working at CNN covering this all while it was happening. And by the way, many of these stories ended up in Project Censored books because the corporate media weren't openly talking about them, even though the independent press was. And you point out that Tapper's, one of the biggest thing that Tapper avoids is his own complicity. Journalism isn't stenography, and he's blaming sources for lying and ignoring his job, which is to interrogate power, not to simply repeat what people in office say.
Exactly. And I think when I pointed that out in there because Tapper kept making this excuse, well, the Democrats lied. It's like, how long have you been in journalism? Of course politicians lie. Duh.
George
Didn't you know
Santos
that?
comes to mind. 7-year prison sentence.
Exactly.
You
Of
get
course
7
they
years.
lied.
You get 7 years. We should be doling these out like candy.
Jake Tapper's just like, gosh, if there was only some like institution or group of people who could expose those lies, we wouldn't have been lied to that whole time during the Biden years.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible, and again, incredulous. It's amazing that, and by the way, like his peer earlier, who took the whole weaponization of fake news and the attacks on the media, Acosta, right? Jim Acosta, who another bestseller, right? Basically making it about him instead of looking, again, another lost opportunity, but opportunists will often make them about themselves, right? So there's more narcissism than Donald Trump going on, and I would say Tapper's exhibiting a little of that. He's going to be going on a whole tell-all tour of why the media can save us, yet he's an exact example of how they don't and didn't.
Yeah. And that's, there's been this whole transformation. And I talk a little bit about it in the article over the last 10 or so years, where the media rightly recognized that Donald Trump, when in his first term, was not a popular candidate. In fact, he was hated by half of the country in a lot of respects. And so they attenuated their commentary to be negative against Trump. It was really good for ratings. People were, we saw an uptick in media viewership. We saw an uptick in people buying political books. There was an uptick in donations to different organizations. So there was a lot of money to be made on critiquing Donald Trump. But the problem is journalism is dependent upon objectivity, or at least appearing to be objective. And so when Trump left office, the media was kind of scrambling for a message. I mean, we have no objectivity. People don't trust us to be objective. And in Trump era 2.0, when Trump's popularity seemingly has increased, at least more so than the Democrats, the media, even when they do expose Trump's lies, which they do some good reporting on Trump, and that needs to be said. The public just isn't listening anymore. And so you see people like Jake Tapper trying to rewrite history to say, like, no, I was always going after power. I was always objective. Or Chris Cuomo is my favorite. He's had the best
he's back. Yeah.
He went from playing interference for his brother and
He
lying to
thinks
the public during
stoned now.
COVID. Yeah, and going after Rogan and lying on immigration. And now he's totally went about face on News Nation, and he sounds like a populist out there.
Yeah, he sounds like a muckraker from the 20th century. I mean, it's cosplay for sure.
Yeah, of course. It's not legit, but they're all trying to do this to recover their image. And I think that the Trump and Biden years have really been terrible for the media, maybe even worse than the WMD years of the Bush years.
The way to recover your credibility is by acting credibly, and not denying that you have a history of sycophancy and chasing, profits for corporate media rather than seeking accountability for people in power by informing the American public. You end your piece, Nolan, by saying credibility once lost isn't easily reclaimed, and the damage isn't just to journalism, it's the democracy itself. And I'm afraid that I agree with you once again on that sentiment, and that it's not a pretty place. But we can rely on people in the independent press to continue to tell these stories. People need to expand their media diets. They need to really seek out sources that are transparently sourced, that are telling us what's going on, and not get swept up in the din of the constant gaslighting and rewriting of history. And maybe even if it's late in the game, George Santos eventually did get held accountable. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his serial lying, right? And again, it's maybe too little too late, but as the title of your piece suggests, we can still have accountability. We can still improve the way in which we're reporting to the public, and I think we really need to do so. That's going to be the main vehicle to what might reform the direction this country is headed. So, Nolan, in the last moment we have, share with us where people can find your work, follow your work, anything else we need to know.
Yeah, I just want to echo that as well. And anything you could do to support local or independent journalism is great. Like, share, support, give a couple bucks if you got it to them.
Subscribe.
Yep. You can find me on YouTube at Disinfo Detox, or you can follow my Substack. I'm nolanhigdon.substack.com. You can sign up there, get the newsletter. It goes right to your email as soon as it's published. And thank you so much for having me on the show, Mickey.
Absolutely a delight. Nolan Higdon, it's always wonderful to have you on the program, and we'll certainly be catching up with you again, and we'll hear more about the Disinfo Detox and the Gaslight Gazette.